In early September 1944, a briefing at Supreme Allied Headquarters took an unexpected turn when reports from multiple sectors along the Western Front revealed a pattern that defied Allied expectations. Entire stretches of territory, once assumed to be fiercely defended, appeared abandoned. Roads were intact. Towns were quiet. German units that intelligence had predicted would fight delaying actions were simply gone. When Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower reviewed the consolidated situation maps alongside U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, the absence was impossible to ignore. These were not isolated gaps caused by rapid breakthroughs. They were wide sectors of the front that should not have been empty. The German retreat was unfolding at a scale and speed that Allied planners had never seriously considered. According to staff officers present, the reaction was not celebration, but unease. Something about the silence did not fit the model of an enemy still capable of resistance. For Eisenhower, the sight raised immediate operational concerns. A retreating enemy was expected to leave rear guards, booby traps, and carefully staged delays. Instead, Allied patrols were reporting minimal contact and little organized resistance. Supply routes lay open. Rail junctions were abandoned before demolition teams could reach them. Eisenhower had seen similar patterns earlier in the war, and he knew that sudden emptiness could mean several things: collapse, deception, or a calculated withdrawal designed to draw the attacker forward. Marshall, reviewing the reports from Washington's perspective, shared the concern. As Chief of Staff, he was responsible not only for winning the campaign, but for ensuring that the American Army did not walk blindly into a trap. A defeated enemy could still be dangerous, especially one retreating toward prepared defensive lines deeper inside Germany. The intelligence picture offered few clear answers. Intercepts suggested confusion within German command structures, but not total disintegration. Prisoner interrogations described exhaustion, shortages, and conflicting orders, yet they did not explain why entire sectors had been vacated so abruptly. German units appeared to be retreating faster than higher headquarters could track, leaving behind equipment they could not move and positions they could not hold. Eisenhower questioned whether this was a temporary breakdown or the sign of something more fundamental. If the German army in the West was truly collapsing, the Allies faced an extraordinary opportunity. If not, the emptiness ahead could conceal a reorganized defense waiting to strike. Marshall approached the problem with strategic caution. He had spent years preparing the American army for a long war of attrition, not a sudden pursuit across hundreds of miles. He worried that success in France was creating dangerous assumptions. Empty ground encouraged speed, speed strained logistics, and strained logistics could cripple even the most powerful force. Marshall pressed Eisenhower to consider whether the advance was outrunning its intelligence picture. The absence of the enemy, he argued, was itself a form of information, but one that required careful interpretation. An enemy who vanished without a fight was not necessarily defeated. He might simply be choosing when and where to fight next. The discussion between Eisenhower and Marshall revealed a shared anxiety beneath the surface of victory. The German retreat did not look like previous withdrawals the Allies had studied. It lacked order, but also lacked the chaos of complete collapse. The front was moving, but not in predictable ways. Eisenhower recognized that the campaign had entered a phase where traditional assumptions no longer applied. The Allies were no longer forcing the enemy back one line at a time. They were advancing into space the enemy had already abandoned. By the end of the briefing, one conclusion stood out. The emptiness ahead was not reassuring. It was a warning. Whether the German army was disintegrating or repositioning, the situation demanded caution as well as speed. For Eisenhower and Marshall alike, the realization was unsettling. The war in the West was no longer unfolding as planned, and the absence of resistance raised questions that success alone could not answer. As Allied forces advanced into the unexpectedly vacant sectors, reports from the front became increasingly contradictory. Reconnaissance units moved through villages without encountering resistance, Yet radio traffic hinted at German formations retreating in fragments rather than in organized columns. Eisenhower demanded clarification. Were the Germans fleeing in disorder, or were they executing a deliberate withdrawal toward stronger positions? The distinction mattered. A disintegrating enemy could be pursued aggressively. A withdrawing enemy could still strike with precision, if given the chance. Eisenhower consulted closely with George C. Marshall, whose strategic instincts urged restraint. Marshall warned that rapid advances through empty territory created an illusion of safety. Without reliable intelligence, speed became guesswork, and guesswork in war often ended in disaster. Field commanders echoed the uncertainty. Some reported that German units had simply melted away, abandoning heavy equipment and leaving behind exhausted stragglers. Others warned of scattered resistance and sudden ambushes, signs that German forces were still capable of inflicting damage when opportunities arose. Engineers discovered bridges left intact where demolitions had been expected, while in other areas they found roads cratered at the last moment. The inconsistency troubled Eisenhower. A collapsing army usually left chaos behind. A reorganizing one left patterns. What the Allies were seeing appeared to be neither. Marshall suggested that the German command might have lost the ability to enforce a coherent withdrawal, forcing local commanders to act independently. That kind of breakdown could accelerate defeat, but it could also make the battlefield more unpredictable. Logistics soon amplified the concern. As Allied units surged forward, supply lines stretched rapidly. Fuel convoys struggled to keep pace, and ammunition stocks thinned as units advanced farther from established depots. The emptiness ahead encouraged commanders to push harder, assuming resistance would remain light. Marshall cautioned that such assumptions ignored the realities of supply and coordination. Even a weakened enemy could exploit overstretched forces. Eisenhower shared the concern. He had seen how quickly momentum could turn into vulnerability if the front outran its support. The German retreat, whatever its cause, was pulling the Allies into territory they had not yet prepared to sustain. Intelligence analysts attempted to piece together a clearer picture. Intercepts suggested that German commanders were struggling to re-establish defensive lines, hampered by fuel shortages, damaged communications, and conflicting orders from higher command. Prisoner interrogations reinforced the impression of exhaustion and low morale, but they also revealed pockets of determination. Some German units, particularly those tasked with holding river crossings and key junctions, appeared ready to fight hard despite the broader retreat. Eisenhower understood that these nodes could become deadly choke points if the Allies advanced blindly. Marshall urged that speed be matched with caution, insisting that the absence of resistance did not mean the absence of danger. The discussion between Eisenhower and Marshall increasingly focused on balance. How much momentum could be safely exploited without risking overextension? The German retreat was offering opportunities, but it was also distorting Allied decision-making. Empty ground tempted commanders to race ahead, yet the very emptiness deprived them of clear intelligence about the enemy's intentions. Eisenhower recognized that the campaign was entering a phase where judgment mattered more than doctrine. The Allies were no longer breaking through prepared defenses, they were advancing into uncertainty. By the end of the day, Eisenhower issued guidance emphasizing measured progress. Reconnaissance was to be strengthened, flanks were to be secured, supply priorities were to be reassessed. The German retreat would be exploited, but not at the cost of control. Marshall approved the approach, seeing it as a necessary correction to the headlong pursuit unfolding across France. The emptiness ahead remained unsettling. It suggested weakness, but also concealed risk. For Eisenhower and Marshall, the challenge was clear. Victory was accelerating, but understanding lagged behind. And in war, advancing faster than understanding could be as dangerous as standing still. As the Allies pushed deeper into the territory the Germans had abandoned, the consequences of the empty front began to reveal themselves in unexpected ways. Units that advanced rapidly encountered stretches of road where traffic jams replaced resistance, as columns of Allied vehicles converged on routes never meant to support such volume. The absence of the enemy created its own form of friction. Commanders struggled to determine priorities when every direction appeared open. Eisenhower received reports of divisions advancing on parallel axes without clear coordination, each assuming that speed was the overriding requirement. George C. Marshall followed these developments closely from Washington, noting that the German retreat was testing Allied command discipline as much as German strength. An enemy that withdrew without fighting forced commanders to confront choices they had not planned for, and those choices carried strategic consequences. The Germans, meanwhile, were not simply fleeing without purpose. Intelligence updates began to suggest that while frontline resistance had evaporated, German efforts were concentrating around key river lines and fortified regions farther east. The retreat through France appeared to be a desperate attempt to shorten the front and re-establish control closer to Germany's borders. Eisenhower recognized the danger. An enemy retreating under pressure might abandon ground, but he would not abandon every advantage. Rivers, urban strongpoints, and natural barriers still offered opportunities to slow the Allied advance. Marshall warned that empty ground could lull commanders into assuming the enemy was finished, when in fact he was merely repositioning. The German retreat, far from signaling the end of the campaign, might be setting the stage for its next, more difficult phase. Reports from the field reinforced this interpretation. Allied patrols encountered hastily prepared defenses guarding bridges and crossings, manned by German units ordered to hold at all costs. These isolated positions, though limited in number, inflicted casualties and delayed advances out of proportion to their size. The pattern troubled Eisenhower. It suggested that the German army was sacrificing space to buy time, trading territory for the opportunity to reorganize. Marshall viewed this as a classic defensive maneuver, albeit executed under extreme pressure. The emptiness behind the retreating Germans was not accidental. It was the result of an army shedding weight to survive. Logistical challenges compounded the situation. Fuel shortages began to slow advances in some sectors, while others surged ahead, creating uneven progress along the front. Eisenhower understood that such imbalance could not be sustained indefinitely. Empty territory encouraged pursuit, but pursuit without supply invited collapse. Marshall pressed for stricter control over logistics, emphasizing that the German retreat had changed the nature of the campaign, but not its fundamental requirements. Armies still needed fuel, ammunition, and coordination, regardless of how little resistance they encountered. By mid-September, Eisenhower faced a sobering realization. The German retreat had created the illusion of simplicity in a campaign that was becoming more complex by the day. The Allies were advancing into a vacuum that concealed both opportunity and danger. Marshall agreed. From his vantage point, the retreat was not a sign that the war was nearly over, but that it was entering a new, uncertain phase. The Germans were no longer contesting every mile, but they were choosing where to fight, and that choice mattered. The empty front, once a symbol of Allied success, now served as a warning. It demonstrated that the enemy still retained agency, even in retreat. Eisenhower adjusted his expectations accordingly. The pursuit would continue, but it would be tempered by preparation for the resistance that lay ahead. The German retreat had not ended the war in the West. It had merely shifted its geography. And as Eisenhower and Marshall understood, the hardest battles often began after the enemy seemed to disappear. By the time Allied forces reached the eastern edge of France, the meaning of the empty sectors Eisenhower and Marshall had first questioned became unmistakably clear. The German retreat had not been a simple collapse, but a forced transformation of the battlefield. Space had been traded for time. The absence of resistance that once promised a swift end to the campaign now revealed its cost. German forces, battered but not destroyed, had regrouped behind natural barriers and fortified regions where their remaining strength could be concentrated. Rivers such as the Moselle and the approaches to the German border became focal points of renewed resistance. Eisenhower recognized that the campaign had crossed an invisible threshold. The pursuit phase was over. What followed would demand methodical operations against an enemy that, though weakened, had regained coherence. Marshall viewed this development as confirmation of his earlier caution. From Washington, he assessed the situation not as a missed opportunity, but as an inevitable progression. The German army had survived by shedding territory and abandoning untenable positions. In doing so, it had preserved enough combat power to prolong the war. Marshall understood that no retreat of this scale occurred without cost, but neither did it signal immediate defeat. He warned that expectations of a rapid conclusion had to be adjusted. The empty front had distorted perceptions at every level of command, encouraging assumptions that no longer applied. Now, the Allies faced a familiar reality: prepared defenses, logistical strain, and a determined enemy fighting closer to home. Eisenhower adapted accordingly. Supply priorities were tightened, command boundaries clarified, and advances synchronized to prevent further imbalance along the front. The emphasis shifted from speed to sustainability. The Allies would continue to press forward, but with greater attention to coordination and support. Eisenhower's experience told him that victory depended not on how quickly ground was taken, but on how effectively forces were positioned to hold it. Marshall endorsed this approach, seeing it as the only way to convert success in France into decisive pressure on Germany itself. In retrospect, the moment when entire sectors appeared empty marked a turning point in the Western campaign. It revealed the limits of pursuit and the dangers of interpreting absence as weakness. The German retreat had been chaotic, but it had not been mindless. It was a survival strategy executed under extreme conditions. Eisenhower and Marshall had sensed this early. Even as Allied forces advanced through seemingly uncontested territory, their caution did not slow victory, but it shaped how that victory would be achieved. The episode also left a lasting impression on Allied military thinking. It underscored the importance of intelligence, logistics, and discipline in exploiting success. Speed could open doors, but it could also obscure what lay beyond them. Eisenhower emerged from the campaign with a reinforced belief that command required patience as much as boldness. Marshall's strategic restraint proved equally vital, ensuring that enthusiasm did not override preparation. When the war in Western Europe finally ended months later, the empty front of early September 1944 stood out as one of its most deceptive moments. What looked like a clear path to victory had concealed the final challenges of the campaign. Eisenhower and Marshall's response to that moment helped ensure that the Allies were ready when resistance returned. The German retreat had created silence where battle was expected, but that silence was never an end in itself. It was a pause, one that demanded judgment, restraint, and resolve. In that sense, the emptiness Eisenhower and Marshall confronted was not merely an absence of the enemy. It was a test of leadership. How the Allies responded to it determined not just the pace of the advance, but the stability of the victory that followed.